This is the FM Gold channel of All In. We bring you a discussion on outcome of 32nd GST Council meeting. The participants are Pawan Arora, economic analyst, and Shishir Sinha, journalist.
The 32nd meeting of GST Council took slew of measures to help micro, small and medium enterprises. One of the decision was raising the threshold to 40 lakh from 20 lakh rupees and of course to rupees 20 lakh from rupees 10 lakh in northeastern and hilly states. How do you see this decision? How this is going to help micro, small and medium enterprises?
Actually, after the introduction of GST, some compliances burdens are coming to the SSEs and taxpayers, and they are not able to understand it, complicated compliances. One of the reasons that they are starting to avoid these taxes. So now this increase in the threshold limit would out some taxpayers. So it would be beneficial for very small SSEs who have a turnover of less than 40 lakhs and in the 20 lakhs in the specific states. So that is beneficial for the small SSEs. But if you see the very interesting point, at the very first time, the GST Council has given the decision-making power to the states. What is the concept of GST Council is that whatever GST Council will decide, every state and center has to comply that. But this time, the GST Council has given the power to the states to decide whether they want to opt this 40 lakh limit or 20 lakh limit. But in my view, if you see that due to the upcoming election, every state have a political pressure to increase their threshold limit. So this is beneficial for the small SSE as well as for the states.
There is one catch in this decision, and that is that the threshold has been raised for the goods supplier only and not for the services supplier. What is the rationale behind that?
If you see that the major input for the small, even if I say middle class family and the small class families, are the goods, not the services. The services, I don't think so there is a big rationale behind this. Let us say I reduce the tax rate or I reduce the slab rate of services. Your end services are like you use telephone services. These are very big clients. So very small taxpayers are not the service providers. And if they increase the threshold limit for them also, that will reduce the tax base for the government.
Why there is a need to be a GST SSE? I mean, what we have seen from the numbers that almost 45 lakh SSEs are having turnover less than rupees 20 lakh. I mean 20 lakh is the threshold limit. So why there is a need to be a GST SSE? How this helps a business to grow?
If you go back at the time of implementation of GST, one very crucial provision has come into the GST first time, that reverse charge on the supplies received from the unregistered supplier by the registered supplier. After the introduction of this provision, every big corporates, even the government departments and the PSUs have make a policy not to buy any goods or services from the unregistered supplier. So due to this provision, the unregistered supplier were facing the problems in reduction in their sales. Because if you see, there are many instances like stationery, like printing expenditures and like small kitchen items or sanitary items. Even you take the example of big corporates also, they are taking it from the unregistered supplier. But after making that policy, their sales get reduced. SSE have started to take the registration, even their threshold limit was less than 20 lakhs. This is the only reason. But if you take the today's scenario, these provisions, reverse charge on unregistered supplies have been deferred and it is continue to be deferred continuously. And if you see the upcoming amendment in the law, now the government is taking into another side, government is saying that now we will specify the person who are required to pay reverse charge in this section. Only reason which I see why the people are taking registration voluntarily, even they are under the threshold limit, to increase their customer base.
And another issue is the composition scheme. Now we have reworked the composition scheme. The threshold will be of course 1.5 crore rupees from 1 crore rupees, and that will be applicable from April 1, 2019. There are two major changes. One is that you have to file annual return and not the quarterly return. But there is no change in depositing the tax that you have to deposit in a quarter. How do you see these changes?
If you take the example of the income tax, every time you heard that whenever the government increases the minimum limit of tax. So every time they say that because increasing the limit of exemption, the tax base increased and ultimately in the long run the government's revenue increased. So one of the intention behind this increasing the threshold limit to take the maximum SSE within the tax ambit. Today's, if you go into the market, every SSE wants to sleep with a compliant SSE. But due to very complicated provisions and due to the fear of the investigations, people do not want to even take the registration. Even they want to comply, but due to the fear of the department, they don't want to take the registration. Now, this composition scheme, if you see, it's a very simple scheme. You just pay 1% on your total turnover and meter-ends. So now this composition scheme is available to the SSE who has a turnover of 1.5 crore. So now it will win-win situation for the both. For the government revenues in the long run, that it will increase the base, and for the SSEs who want to comply but till date they have not taken registration to avoid the complications of the law. Secondly, if you see that the government has good initiative they have introduced, is that they are introducing the one annual return instead of the quarterly returns. So if you see that, as I told you earlier, that people don't want to get into the complication of the tax regimes. So earlier they are required to file 4 returns. Now they have to take external assistance for filing the returns. Now they are required to file only one annual return. And that's because the government revenue not get hit. The government has restricted this provision for the annual return only and not for the tax payment.
The present composition scheme says that trader, manufacturer and just one service, that the restaurant service, are the part of the composition scheme. Now there is a special scheme for the service provider, for the small service provider, where the threshold has been fixed at 50 lakh rupees and the GST rate will be 6%. How do you think that this will help the small service provider?
In the existing system, if you see, there are 3 clauses. One is for the supplier of the goods, one is for the manufacturer, which is 1% for the both. But interestingly, even if you see in the existing system, there is a one composition scheme for the restaurant. They are required to pay 5% on their turnover. But I want to aware from this session that the restaurant service providers who have opted the composition scheme earlier can now leave that composition scheme, because today the tax rate in the normal scheme is also 5%.
That too without input tax.
But it is better to opt the normal scheme rather than composition scheme, because in the composition scheme you cannot collect the tax from the customers, but in the normal scheme you can collect the customers. And if you see very small restaurants, they are unaware, so they are charging the taxes under composition scheme 5%, but if they will opt for normal scheme, then they can charge 5% from the customers. Now if you see the supplier of goods, they have increased the limit up to even 1.5 crore. But what the problem is coming with the small supplier of goods, what the problem they are facing, they are facing that, let us say I am taking example a seller of goods who have a very small rental income. They were not able to opt the composition scheme because of the act which says that scheme is available for the goods supplier. Now in the previous amendment, what they have done, they have said that if the value of the total turnover is 10% of the service, then they can opt for the composition scheme. But now they are taking further relief for the service providers. They are saying that we will introduce a new composition scheme for the service provider who are the wholly service provider with a 6% rate, and for the provider who are the supplier of goods and service. But this is up to the limit of 50 lakh.
So what is the concept of mixed supply? Because this is one thing which is it's very difficult to understand, that it's goods also, services also. So under the new composition scheme with the threshold of 50 lakh rupees and GST at 6% for the service provider, there is one concept called mixed supply. What is that concept?
Mixed supply, in the GST Council press release, what they mean to say? They mean to say that the service provider who is also supplying the goods, who are dealing in the goods as well as service, they are in the current position, if their value of the service is exceeding the 10% of their total over, they cannot avail the composition scheme. In that council, they are going to introduce a scheme that if you are the service provider as well as the goods provider, then you can take the composition scheme also. But it has a separate concept.
The entire various measures as announced by GST Council, there is an expectation that it will have a revenue hit of almost 5,200 crore rupees. Do you think that these measures will really help to bridge the gap and will help to recover more and more GST money?
If you see the yesterday's meeting, that is majorly on the composition scheme changes. And if you see that, as we are discussing, that compositions increasing in the limit of the composition scheme ultimately increase the tax base of the customer. So it will ultimately in the long run will increase the revenue of the government. Let us say if the dealer is not taking registration at this stage due to some reasons, if he will take the registration today, then there are less chances process of breaking the chain. Now government have the report from the manufacturing till the retail line, if that retailer will also get into the chain of the tax payment.
One thing which I believe is must for our listeners to know, that this is something called 40 lakh rupees or 1.5 crore. That is the threshold. It is mandatory only when you are crossing that threshold.
Yes.
Below that, all these are the voluntary. It depends upon you whether you want to have GST or not. Now, one issue where the decision could not be taken and matter was referred to a group of finance minister, that was GST on the under construction flat. What is the significance of this proposal?
From the very beginning of the GST, government is continuously saying that builders are earning the profit from the input tax credit, which is additionally available to them under the GST regime. And they are saying that builders should transfer the benefit to the customers. And today they are saying that because the builders are not transferring the customer and builders are eligible to almost 6 to 7% ITC and output tax is 12%, no, we are making it to 5% output tax without ITC. But if you see the technicalities of this decision which they are trying to introduce is not a win-win situation for the builders as well as for the customers. Because if you take the example of the urban areas like Delhi and Bombay, also Noida, NCR regions, here almost 80 to 90% value is of the land. Even today also government is indirectly taxing the land value, although they have excluded the land, because they are only allowing the 1/3 deduction. As I said, the land value is 80 to 90%. Now if they will do the tax rate at 5%, what it happened, builder will not eligible for the ITC. Ultimately they will increase their cost. So the units which are not sold, that prices will be increased by the builders, and the units which are already sold, that will result into the loss of input tax credit to the builders. So it is not a win-win situation for the already sold flats for the builders.
At present, if it is a under construction flat, then the rate of effective GST is 12%, and since the builders get input tax credit, so it is expected that final rate which customer is going to pay is something around 4 to 5%. The other thing is the affordable housing, where the effective rate is 8%.
Yes.
And after the input tax credit, the final rate will also come down. If it is a ready to move in flat, then there is a no GST at present. Another issue where decision could not be taken was the lottery thing. How significant this is?
Actually, there is a exemption in the GST law regarding the actionable claims, but they have excluded lotteries from the actionable claims. So people have started to challenge that lottery is not a goods, but it is an actionable claim and that is not liable to tax. Now recently Kolkata High Court has given the judgment that lotteries are the goods and liable to tax under the GST. Now in order to increase the tax revenue in this and to end the dispute, government is thinking to introduce some new scheme for that lotteries.
Cabinet took a number of decisions, and one of the decisions was setting up 3 aims in various parts of the country, and also re-promulgating 3 ordinances, one on the Triple Talaq, one on the Companies Act, and another one on the Medical Council. How do you see these decisions?
If you see that introduction of 3 new aims, that is already been introduced by the government, and now it's a very welcome initiative by the government. Government is taking it into Pradhan Mantri Suraksha Yojana by introducing 3 aims in the Jammu and the Kashmir and in the Gujarat. It will increase the medical infrastructure. If you see that AIIMS has a very good quality and very renowned in the world. If you see the hilly areas have to move for the good treatment.
Health facilities.
They have to move for urban areas.
What about the re-promulgation of the 3 ordinances, especially on the Triple Talaq and the Companies Act?
Whatever government pass an ordinance to impose over the country, that has to be effectuate within the 6 months by bringing the bill and by passing it in the parliament. But these 3 ordinances have getting expired during this month, so therefore the government yesterday has re-promulgate, basically I will say reinstate it, so that they will get further 4 times, because if you see that Rajya Sabha as nowadays get disturbed, so they therefore re-promulgate it. These are the reasons for getting it. One of the very crucial ordinance in this case is the ordinance regarding the Triple Talaq. If we say it is very much required for the women of the Muslim regions, because
when you talk about equality and all those things, I mean, if there is a system like this, that will really affect the entire equality concept. Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on outcome of 32nd GST Council meeting. The participants were Pawan Arora, economic analyst, and Shishir Sinha, journalist. This